very much. Great to see so many faces here to hear my seminar, which I've managed to get out of doing for 3 or 4 years. So here I am, finally in the flesh to do it. So I'm going to be presenting one of my PhD papers to you today, the full title of which is How Do Trust Relationships and Competitive Program Design Affect Collaborative Behaviour in Private Land Conservation Programs, which is quite a long title, so I just put an abbreviated version up there. So of course I have to thank my supervisors for their many hours of help with this paper. Saeed, Steve said he would be here, Abby and Kerry over... He's got time, 10 past, we'll be right. And Kerry of course over at UQ, and of course acknowledge the funding bodies that made my PhD research possible. So I would like to start this story right back at the beginning, which I think is around about 2012. So at that time I was working on a project that looked pretty closely at conservation tender instruments. And that project involved going to country Victoria to interview landholders about their experiences in conservation tender programs. So as you can see from this photo, which was indeed taken during that fieldwork, this project convinced me that conservation tenders are really cool, and that they were so cool, in fact, that I was willing to spend the next 5 years continuing to study them. So during this fieldwork, a few different insights came up, which in hindsight appear to have kind of bubbled away in my brain over the course of my PhD and popped up in various places, which you'll see throughout the talk today. So these insights were, firstly, the importance of social relationships of different kinds to these sorts of programs, be it landholder-landholder social relationships, or in this work probably more landholder-agency relationships. Secondly, the second insight was about the reaction of landholders to the use of competitive tendering when they had previously been used to more non-competitive mechanisms, and there was some sort of almost discomfort associated with that. And thirdly, the whole idea of landscape scale conservation and wildlife corridors, which, being pretty new to the field, was something that I hadn't really thought about before. And specifically, the fact that to some degree collaboration between landholders might be required to get landscape scale conservation programs to work in practice. So that brings me to my next slide, which is about collaboration. So collaboration is really the key concept underpinning this paper, and given this I think it warrants a bit of a working definition given the many and varied ways that it has been defined throughout the literature. So for our purposes today, collaboration is when two landholder participants in a private land conservation program work together on a joint project to achieve a common conservation objective. Each collaborator depends on the other to fulfil the joint contract such that the monetary reward of each is contingent upon the actions of the other in some way. So if one of them stuffs up in some sense, they both pay the price. So why would we bother having people collaborate in private land conservation programs? Well, firstly, and as I've already alluded to, there could be ecological benefits associated with programs that go beyond property boundaries. There's some evidence that transaction costs for agencies could be minimised by having people team up. They have fewer applications to process or bids to process, and fewer and perhaps less geographically dispersed sites to visit, although that is a little bit contentious. There's sort of evidence for both sides. There could be economies of scale for landholders associated with teaming up to implement larger scale projects. I'll try not to break the microphone. The collaborative process itself might improve social capital, assuming, of course, that things don't go pear-shaped within the collaboration. And participation rates could be increased by collaboration with more enthusiastic landholders, potentially recruiting their less enthusiastic neighbours, acquaintances, friends, or whoever. Despite these advantages, only a limited number of collaborative programs, or programs offering collaborative options, have been implemented in the field to date. And these have largely been what I would say are pilot level programs in Australia, UK, Bolivia and Peru. So this has started to happen, incorporating collaboration into private land conservation programs, but given this, we still have obviously a lot to learn, and this is where we hope that this paper and my thesis as a whole starts to make a contribution. So given all these potential advantages that I've just outlined that could be associated with collaborative conservation, it's important to consider what could go wrong and stop it from working well. So these two factors came from my search through the literature, and they popped out to me not only because they popped up quite frequently in the literature, but also because they really resonated with the insights I had gained, not insults, definitely insights I had gained, talking to landholders about their experiences in conservation tender programs. So the first of these is that landholders might not trust their collaborative partner to pull their weight, in a sense, and therefore be unwilling to actually collaborate. So that ties in with what I knew about the importance of social relationships. Secondly, if a competitive program design is used, the drive to compete with other landholders might suppress the drive to collaborate, which sort of shares themes with what I'd heard people say about competitive tendering mechanisms. So from here, I'm now going to go through each of these two factors in turn, offer a bit of a definition, and explain how each of them have been linked to collaboration in the literature, and therefore move towards the process of introducing the research questions for this paper. Firstly, trust. The most common definition in the literature that I came across was this one from Rousseau et al., which says that trust is a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based on the positive expectations of the intentions of another. It's a little bit of a stuffy definition, I think, but it suits our purposes well enough. When I went hunting in the literature, I found quite a substantial body of work that links these two concepts. There were many, many studies that were unrelated to private land conservation programs, field studies, lab studies, interview studies, in all sorts of contexts, management, business, nurses and doctors, all sorts of different studies. What I could find that was actually related to private land conservation programs was limited to landholder surveys and interviews, which were of course very valuable to me because they suggested a whole lot of factors that could be interesting to explore further. But despite this, a few gaps jumped out to us. Firstly, we saw a need for an incentivised study in the private land conservation context to actually test that the previously observed and reported linkage between trust and collaboration still apply in the private land conservation project. There's no particular reason to think that it wouldn't, but of course we always want to test these things. Possibly more interestingly, we also noticed in the literature that it wasn't really explicitly dealt with what the counterfactual to a trusting relationship was. The obvious assumption is that it's a distrusting relationship, which is fine, but we also wondered how collaboration with a person you simply just don't know that well might fit into this picture. And that wasn't dealt with at all, so far as we could see. So that's trust. Now, competitive program design. So when I talk about competitive program design, what I mean is a conservation tender or a reverse auction. And I would think in this room there's a fair bit of familiarity with what these are. But nonetheless, exactly what I mean is a program in which there is one buyer, that is the implementing agency, conservation agency, government agency, and many sellers, and they are, of course, the landholders. These landholder sellers submit bids to the agency specifying how much money you would need to pay them to undertake a particular conservation project. The buyer, the agency, then ranks all of the bids they have received for cost effectiveness using some sort of metric of ecological or conservation value. They accept the best bids until their budget is used up. Winners are typically then paid their bid amount. So this describes a budget-constrained discriminatory priced tender. There are other variants, but this is what's most commonly actually occurred in the field. These programs, conservation tenders, are thought to be more cost-effective, to achieve more for the conservation dollar than the obvious alternative, which is a flat rate program, which offers uniform payments to all participants, and there isn't a direct competitive element, so essentially everyone is accepted, and certainly in the study that I'm about to describe, everyone is accepted. I found a bit of literature that linked competition with collaboration, and the vast majority of the studies that I came across were unrelated to private land conservation programs. In this literature, collaboration and competition are very much presented as opposing forces, things that work against each other, and not things that coexist. In the few studies that I found that were actually related to private land conservation programs, various authors sort of flagged this collaboration-competition tension as a possible challenge associated with collaborative conservation programs, but beyond pointing it out, they didn't really go any further than that, which said to us there was scope to actually test this via an incentivised study in the private land conservation context. Which brings us now to the research questions, which are, how does collaborative behaviour vary across different trust relationships, specifically comparing trusting, distrusting and unknown partnerships, which was something that hadn't been looked at before. Secondly, how does collaborative behaviour vary under different program designs? And by this we mean comparing competitive and non-competitive program types. And thirdly, how do trust relationships and program design jointly affect collaboration? So to what extent do these two factors interact with one another? And we decided that laboratory experiments were a good place to start to address our questions, because we like laboratory experiments. That's not really the reason. Because given the state of the landholder surveys and interviews, the state of that literature that had explored our factors of interest in the private land conservation context, the obvious next step seemed to be to test it under incentivised circumstances in the lab as a kind of a stepping stone towards field experimentation. So this is our experimental design, and there were two treatments. So our experimental subjects participated in a simulated conservation tender program, which was either non-competitive, flat rate, or competitive, a tender. And they did this with an unknown partner or a known partner. I'll just run through one of the treatments to give you an idea of the sequencing of events, and I think from there it'll be pretty self-evident how the other variants functioned. So the first thing that subjects did was the lottery choice activity. This was a standard risk aversion measurement protocol from Holt and Laurie. The second thing that they did was this trust game. I've also put in brackets DISC. And this was the game that we used to build a relationship between our experimental subjects that was a proxy for a trust or distrust relationship. It could go either way, depending on how they behaved. In this particular treatment, these subjects retained the same partner and went on to do the simulated conservation program. So obviously the idea was to observe the effect of this trust treatment on behaviour in the conservation game. Whereas the unknown partner subject had no prior experience with the person that they were paired with. The final activity was a survey which measured a range of socio-demographic characteristics associated with our sample members. Environmental attitudes were also measured, and we included some qualitative questions that allowed subjects to explain in their own words what had motivated their decision making in the experiment. As you can see, there were generally 60 subjects in each treatment, except for flat rate unknown, which had 68, simply because on one particular day, 2 people decided they wouldn't show up. So we ended up with an extra session, but the data's still been included in the analysis.
What kind of people is there?
Students. So predominantly undergraduate, mixture, half-half undergraduate and postgraduate students. I have got a slide at the very end of the socio-demographics because I thought someone might be interested in knowing about that. So we can look at it at the end. So this is the trust game, the game that we use to build proxy trust or distrust relationships between our subjects. And we took this game directly from a study by Hull and Weigelt, but we implemented it using quite a different design from what they had done. The game is played in pairs, and there are 2 roles, role A and role B. The key decision that needs to be made by subjects is whether to pass or take a given amount of money. A pass decision means that the round continues. This depicts one round, this whole diagram. And the decision is deferred to one's partner if you choose to pass. By contrast, if a subject chooses to take, the round finishes then and there, and that subject chooses how to allocate a particular amount of money between themselves and their partner. So this pass-take decision could happen up to 4 times in a given round. And you'll notice along the bottom here that the more they chose to pass, the more money was available to them. So you can see that the more they trust each other, such as it's operationalised in this game, the more they earn. Right? So our subjects played 6 rounds of this game with the same partner, and they alternated between role A and role B, so they had equal chance to be first mover. And we use behaviour in this game to classify subjects as either trusting or distrusting. I can go into more detail about this process at the end because we did it in a bunch of different ways, but the one presented in the analysis today looked at the joint earnings of the partnership in the last 2 rounds of play, round 5 and 6, and divided them into groups. Everyone above a certain amount of earnings was trusting, and below was distrusting. And I have the histogram at the end that you can see if you want to at the end. So this game let us classify people as trusting or distrusting. Now the conservation game. I'll say here that it took me a good 20-25 minutes to explain this to subjects in the lab. So I'll do my best to get across the key points in the next sort of 5 minutes, and hopefully we'll understand enough to make sense of the results. As I've already said, there were 2 variants, the flat rate and the tender version, non-competitive, competitive. In terms of framing, the subjects were asked to imagine they were farmers undertaking a tree planting project. In the game, subjects made up to 3 choices. Firstly, whether to collaborate with their partner, yes or no. Secondly, what bid value to submit to the auction. Clearly this was only relevant to the tender program, and that was expressed in experimental dollars. So when I say dollars from now on, I mean experimental dollars. And thirdly, how much effort to expend on their conservation project, which was expended on a 0 to 10 scale and only in whole units. So there were no part effort units able to be expended. And subjects played 10 rounds with the same partner. For those who had previously completed this game, it was the same person. And as soon as they finished this game, they were told, you're now going to play another game with the same person. So they knew that they had the same partner. So I'll walk you quickly through some of the key parameters of the game. Compensation from the agency. For individuals in the flat rate was $100, again experimental dollars. I wish I could have paid it in Australian dollars. In the tender program, they earned their individual bid, provided that it had won, obviously. For collaborators, in the flat rate, $120 per person. In the tender, half of their joint bid per person. So that's the amount they would receive from the agency if all went to plan. All collaborators in both program types incurred a $10 per person negotiation cost, which was intended to capture additional transaction costs associated with forming collaborative partnerships. Obviously, we needed a way to rank the bids in the tender, and so we needed some sort of ecological metric, and that was habitat score for us. Each subject had 1 piece of land to put into the program, and they were assumed to be physically homogeneous, so they didn't vary between subjects. But if they were submitted to the auction as part of an individual bid, they were scored 10 habitat score units, whereas in a collaborative bid, they were scored 12.5 habitat score units per person, 25 for the collaborative project in total. I mentioned that effort could be expended on a 0 to 10 scale. There was a cost associated with effort, and these were the costs, essentially, in addition with the negotiation costs of the subjects. That was how their costs were represented. It was a $10 effort cost per unit. To actually receive their compensation, the numbers listed up here, in the tender they obviously had to win first, but in addition to that, subjects had to put in a minimum amount of effort, otherwise they would not be paid. For individuals, and for reasons we can talk about later if you want, the minimum effort requirement was 6 units. If they didn't put at least 6 in, they got nothing. We'll go through that a bit in a minute. For collaborators, however, it was 13 units between the 2 of them, deliberately chosen as an uneven number. And the program budget, I mentioned before, it's a budget-constrained tender, and that was 500 experimental dollars.
What exactly is the effort? What does it?
That's intended to represent the cost of implementing the project.
So between 1 and 10?
Between 1 and 10.
When you say you got effort threshold is 6 units.
You have to put in at least 6 or you don't get paid. Collaborative pairs have to put in at least 13 effort units or they don't get paid.
Which means spending 60.
So that's their
Spend
spending.
60 minimum
60 on what?
On implementing the project, planting their trees, etc., etc.
When do I have to commit to that?
Shall I go through the game in a bit more detail and hopefully things will become clear? Otherwise this really could take all day, as it did in the lab sometimes. So this presents some of the same information, but hopefully it will clarify a few questions about how things worked. As I mentioned, there was a collaboration choice, and that was the first phase, collaboration strategy. So I said it was a yes-no choice. To continue as a collaborative partnership, both subjects within the pair had to be willing to collaborate. If one or both were not, they instead participated as individuals. The second phase was only relevant to the tender, and that was the bid setting phase. Collaborative pairs went through a bid negotiation process, which again I'll not talk about much here, but can tell you more about after if you need. If they managed to successfully negotiate a joint bid, they submitted a joint bid to the auction. If they couldn't agree, however, they instead went through the individual bid setting process. So everybody submitted a bid to the auction. Next was the effort choice phase, which was pretty similar across both program types, well, exactly the same in fact. So for collaborators in the flat rate program, as I said, they had to put in at least 13 units to be paid in both cases. If they did so in the flat rate, they received that 120 that I presented earlier from the agency, minus their own effort cost, minus their negotiation cost. In the tender, however, half of their joint bid, minus their effort costs and negotiation costs. I hope this is becoming a bit clearer. However, if they failed to meet that minimum effort requirement, they would lose the negotiation cost and earn minus 10 in both program types. Individuals, by contrast, only had to put in 6 units. If they did so in the flat rate, 100 minus their effort costs, so 10 times their effort expenditure. And in the tender, it was their bid minus their effort costs. Like I said, it did take me 25 minutes.
The effort cost is the cost of consideration to the pairs.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so if they have to put in a minimum of 6, what makes them consider putting in more?
They shouldn't. So that was something that I didn't want to talk about too much because it was not so important. But
so
there was no reason to. The only reason we
have just fixed it as a cost.
You could have. We just wanted to make the two processes as similar as possible, so that they would appear as similar as possible to the subjects. It also had the added advantage of checking that people understood the rules, understood what we had told them, and they did. So pretty much everyone did put in 6 and not more and not less. We'll get there. We'll get there. We could talk about this all day, like I said. All right, so that's the effort choice. Subjects who had losing bids in the auction earned nothing and sort of sat idle until the next round continues. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough and we can get to more questions if we need to as we go. So based on this game that I've just presented to you with much confusion, we derived 3 binary dependent variables that are the foundation of the analysis that I'm presenting. The first of these was collaboration choice, and that simply designated whether a subject was willing to collaborate or not, their yes-no decision that they had made. The second one was attempted collaboration, which described whether or not a given subject's pair had attempted to enter the program as a collaborative partnership, i.e. both of them were willing to collaborate. Successful collaboration, as it implies, meant that they successfully entered the program as a collaborative partnership. So I'll clarify here that for the flat rate program, these took the exact same values. They didn't vary. The only reason they varied in the tender is that some subjects got to this point but couldn't agree, so they instead went into the individual pathway. And that was the difference between attempted and successful collaboration. Just one independent variable will be presented in the model today, although, as I alluded to, we measured others, and that is a P group and results from our treatments and that classification I mentioned relative to the trust game, right? It has 6 groups: flat rate, unknown partner; flat rate, distrust partner; flat rate, trust partner; tender, unknown partner; tender, distrust partner; tender, trust partner. Colour-coded for your viewing pleasure, I hope. All right, consistently colour-coded after some mistakes on my part. So I'm going to present a couple of descriptive summaries and the results of some random effects panel logit models, which were run with robust standard errors to predict these dependent variables, which, as I said, were all binary. All right, what did we find out from all of this? Well, this figure shows the proportion of times, essentially, subjects were willing to collaborate, attempted to collaborate, or successfully collaborated. You can also see the labels on top of the bars to tell which variable it corresponds to. And along the bottom here, we have different disaggregations within the data. This figure pulls all 10 rounds of play together, and I'll present another one in a minute that separates them out. So we can see for partner type, higher levels of collaborative behaviour for trust subjects, which is good, this is what we would hope to see, and lower levels for unknown and distrust subjects, which are fairly similar to each other, maybe a little higher here. For program type, higher levels of collaborative behaviour in the flat rate program, again what we would hope and expect to see, and lower levels in the tender. Now things get interesting. With our 6 groups, we see a few different stories. Firstly, within flat rate, highest levels of collaborative behaviour from the trust subjects, somewhat lower from the unknown subjects, and lower again for the distrust subjects. Within the tender, the highest levels of collaborative behaviour for the trust subjects, but this time, the middle one is the distrust subjects and the bottom one is the unknown subjects, which does suggest that we have an interaction effect going on here. A couple of things that surprised us, perhaps a little bit, were that there wasn't as strong an effect of program type between the flat rate and the tender trust groups as we might have expected, particularly relative to the difference between these two, which is quite pronounced. And the difference, the program type effect for the distrust groups is essentially not there at all. If anything, tender distrust is higher, which surprised us quite a bit as well. And the last sort of interesting point to note is that the difference between trust and distrust in the tender was smaller than it was in the flat rate. And I'll get to, somehow in time, why that might have been the case. So this figure, by contrast, just presents proportion of time subjects were willing to collaborate, and this time it doesn't pull the rounds, it spreads them out over 10. So you can see how things evolved over the 10 rounds of play. By and large, this tells a similar story to what we saw in this one, but the one additional thing that I would like to draw your attention to is the quite high levels of collaboration in the early rounds from the tender distrust and tender trust subjects, and the fact that more so than the other groups, they decline over the 10 rounds, whereas the others, give or take fluctuation, tend to stay more or less the same. And statistical testing revealed that those two were in fact moderately statistically significant decreasing trends, and not so in any of the other groups. Okay, so here are the results of the panel logit models. I've presented 3 models here, although there are 6 in the main paper. One model corresponding to one different dependent variable, collaboration choice, attempted collaboration, successful collaboration. And in this comparison column here, you can see comparisons between different groups. So what we've essentially done is rotated the base case category in each model to look at the specific differences between groups that we were interested in within flat rate, within tender, and between flat rate and tender. So this value, for example, indicates that flat rate trust subjects were 14.24 times, the odds ratios, 14.24 times more likely to be willing to collaborate than flat rate distrust subjects. It's obviously highly significant. Does that interpretation make sense, hopefully? Good. And this modelling reinforces largely what we saw in the descriptive stuff. The biggest difference within flat rate is between trust and distrust. The others are less so. Within tender, the biggest difference, however, is between unknown and trust. That's highly significant. The biggest difference between flat rate and tender is the 2 unknown groups. As I mentioned, these were closer together than we might have expected. And we'll talk about why in a second. Okay, so what does all this nonsense mean? Hopefully not nonsense, actually, since it's my thesis. Anyway, so we saw some expected results. Firstly, we saw enhanced levels of collaborative behaviour for trust compared to distrust in the flat rate program. Not so much in the tender, although I will add here that in some other models we ran, that difference was more significant when we grouped them differently based on their trust gain behaviour. So there's some evidence that they weren't significant, but some that they were. difference was significant. We expected to see the flat rate program generate higher levels of collaborative behaviour throughout compared to the tender, but we only saw that for the unknown subjects. So we expected what we saw for the unknown subjects. Unexpected results. Why weren't the tender trust and distrust groups more different from one another? As I just said, in some models they were a bit more different, but in this particular one, not so much, and certainly not as big a difference or as significant a difference as in the flat rate. The big question, why didn't the tender reduce collaborative behaviour for trust and distrust subjects? Why did they not differ from their flat rate counterparts? Confusing, many hours spent in Saeed's office crying to try and figure this out. So our eventual interpretation is that this is because of the relative complexity of each program type. So what I mean is that flat rate subjects had a simpler environment to make decisions in, much simpler, to the point where they could generally make their decisions based on quite precise calculations. And I'll go through exactly what I mean by that in a second. By contrast, the tender was more complex, it was more uncertain, and it was more difficult to make decisions, much harder to envision the results of particular courses of action. Therefore, we think that they generally made their decisions based on heuristics, or rules of thumb. I thought that was a cute picture. Got to see a bright side somewhere. All right, so for a flat rate subject, working in quite a simple decision environment, they can quite clearly calculate that by working alone, they're going to earn 40 experimental dollars. So $100 coming in from the agency, $60 in effort costs. And as Tacklety pointed out, no reason to expend anything other than 6 effort units. By collaborating, we know the minimum effort requirement is 13. So we're likely to get some combination of 6 and 7 effort units to get to that point, 7, 7, 6, 7, or 6, 6 maybe, which won't get them over the line. By putting in 7 effort units, they also earn $40, so they're not really any better off than they would have been working alone. But if they can put in 6 units, even some of the time, there's that scope to earn an extra $10. So all these subjects need to do is really assume a particular effort contribution from their partner, calculate their own required effort to meet the minimum requirement, and look at their earnings from working alone versus collaborating. And so that gets us to the point where we see this ordering that we observed in all of the results. Based on their trust relationship, flat rate trust subjects can have some confidence that their partner will be interested in often putting in 7 and sort of allowing both of them to earn more. By contrast, flat rate distrust subjects can have confidence that there's a good chance their partner won't do that. So why would they collaborate? There's not many advantages from that. And flat rate unknown falling sort of somewhere in between, given they have no information to guide their assumptions about their partner's effort contribution. For a tender subject, by contrast, things are a lot more complicated. It's not so simple just to calculate what will happen if I do this or that. And so we're thinking they relied on heuristics, rules of thumb. So some heuristics we might expect them to use. Firstly, that in a competitive, uncertain program that's complex, working alone is just easier. Otherwise, it's just all too much to add collaboration into that mix at all. Another one could be that I had a good or bad experience with my partner in the last game, the trust game. Therefore, there's a good chance I'll have a good or bad experience with my partner again in this game. And to some extent, we saw that for the tender trust and distrust subjects, although not so apparent in these models. What we think has happened is that we introduced an unexpected heuristic that we hadn't thought about in advance, which was, in that trust game, people who played nice tended to earn more. And even if you didn't play nice, you would have been aware that if you had, you would have earned more, right? So what we've communicated is that collaboration in general was beneficial in the last game, so it's probably also beneficial in this game. So what we think has happened is for these tender distrust and tender trust subjects, it's elevated both of them up beyond what we would have expected to see. So, possibly it was weighted more heavily, probably, weighted more heavily than this partner-specific experience that we're talking about. So maybe that explains why they're a bit more similar to each other than we might have otherwise expected, and certainly more so than in the flat rate program. And there's some evidence from the results I've shown that it might have had a limited lifespan. So they've come in the early rounds thinking collaboration was good before, it'll be good now. So let's collaborate, because I can't calculate, how things are likely to work out. But as they got experience with the game and realised this was not necessarily the case, things sort of deteriorated over time. And that might explain that decreasing trend that we observed. Hurry up! All right. Oh, good. We're at the conclusion slide. So what did we learn from all this? Well, subject to 1,001 disclaimers about the fact that this is one set of laboratory experiments in one university, and field testing is required, and there's a bit of a way to go. What do these results tell us about the things we explored relative to conservation programs? Firstly, trust is always going to be a good thing. I think that's pretty intuitive, aligns with the previous literature. Similarly, distrust is never really going to be a particularly good thing. Again, fairly intuitive and aligns with what we had already read about. This is a newer contribution, given that no one had really looked at it. Not knowing one's partner seems to not be so bad in a flat rate program, but pretty catastrophic in the tender. In multiple round tenders, which based on what we've seen should probably really only be considered for trusting partnerships and populations, collaboration may decline over successive rounds. And this new thing that we didn't expect, which is always exciting when you get something you didn't think you would in the experiment, preconceived ideas about collaboration, meaning what they learned in that trust game, collaboration in general, may be important in complex programs where people are sort of relying on heuristics. Nearly done, nearly on time. Where to next? So future directions, also known as things that I really would have liked to do, but unfortunately was quite disorganised and didn't get to. So the main one of these is get some farmers in the lab and rerun the experiment and see how their decision making stacks up against what the students did, and does it match and how does it differ perhaps. After that, the obvious next step is field experimentation, depending on how things go, which would be really fun to do, but sadly is a little bit more expensive than my operating expenses would have allowed. Some other interesting things to build on and explore are larger collaborative groups. So obviously we only looked at partnerships, but collaborations could form with 3, 4, 5, I don't know, however many people. Things are obviously going to get more complex the more people are involved, but I don't know how you'd approach that, but I'm sure someone cleverer than me will think of a way. Spatial analysis. So we've sort of reinforced the existing literature here that trust is important to collaboration, and that, at least from this evidence, applies in the private land conservation program context. So how does trust vary from place to place, population to population, and therefore which areas are more or less receptive to these kinds of collaborative initiatives? That could be an interesting way to proceed. As one, would I call him friendly, thesis examiner pointed out, context-neutral framing would be interesting. So rerun a similar experiment but without sort of tying it to this private land conservation context to get a more general, theoretical, conceptual sense of how these broad concepts of trust, competition and collaboration relate to each other at a high level. And finally, innate trust. The trust that we have built here is very much anchored to experiences that people developed with a particular partner, but there's also the fact that some people are just more trusting people or more collaborative people than others, and that's not something that we've really even touched on at all in this research, and probably something that I wish I'd thought about a little bit more at the start. Okay, so thank you for very patiently and friendlily listening. Comments and nice questions only.